Hello, Dahlia. I misplaced my cup. Hello, Enza. I'm looking for a cup. What cup? Hello, Yona. Sorry, I woke up a little late, so I'm just getting to eat my breakfast. We all did the reading, yes. It was pretty long, but hopefully we got through it. I personally find the section with the spoiled brat, the spoiled Athenian. What's his name? I can't even find it. Anitus. I found that section to be quite boring and pretty difficult to get through. But hey, we're here, and whether or not you finish the reading, we're gonna talk about it. What does this need? It's fine the way it is. Hi, Sarah. And I haven't heard from you a while. I mean, for obvious reasons. You're not in my physics class. Young. How are you doing? Yeah, you're a torpedo and you have rammed into me and caused me to be torpid. Oh, man. Plato, I mean, he's a dramatist, right? And he really succeeds in like making some people appear to be very virtuous, like his teacher Socrates, and a lot of people as like whiners, right? He's very good at that. I mean, the real life Meno probably was not like that. But yeah, it's hilarious. Oh my goodness, and I'm glad she's okay. I know it's a privacy issue. I won't ask specifically what it was about, but was it about? Was she diagnosed with coronavirus or just something else? Okay, well that's good to hear and very scary as well. I'm glad you're okay. I'm glad your family's okay. I wish the Jonas Junies nothing but the best. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a look at where we are in the Meno. Okay. I see. Okay, so sorry, it took a while to kind of like just collect myself. It's around 8 minutes in. This is just a reminder for me to create a timestamp for people who are going to watch the video at a later time. I'm going to take one more bite out of my breakfast and we can kind of start. All right. Actually, while I do this, do you have any questions for me? All right. So, like around the reading, and specifically to help jog your memory, right? There are, I would say, one, two, three really large ideas from Plato's Meno. All right, one is what the question itself, like what is virtue? Two is learning versus recollection, and that they're basically the same thing, okay? Or knowledge as recollection, all right? And then the third idea is knowledge versus true belief or opinion. All right, so I'm going to type these up in the chat, all right? So like, what is virtue? The other is knowledge, acquisition as recollection. And I've misspelled acquisition because I always forget the C. And the third bit is knowledge versus true belief. And I think in our translation by Beckett, it is true opinion. All right. So if you have questions pertaining to any of these three things or any of like the smaller arguments within, I know there's an argument, like one of the premises that Plato uses, or that Socrates, right? We'll call him Plato Socrates, right? So one of the premises that Plato Socrates uses to conclude that virtue is something that can't be taught, and that it is something that is given to us by divine inspiration by the gods, is that virtue cannot be taught. And why can it not be taught? Because there are no teachers of virtue, right? So if you're confused about any of those smaller premises, like we can look about that too. Guten Morgen, Lars. Eine echte Morgen. All right. Enzo's already asked a question. Guys, please post your own. And after I read all of them, I want to kind of like construct a kind of dialogue and like a framework for like how the rest of our live stream will go. And yes, this is also serving as an excuse and some more time for me to eat. But I'm curious to more of your responses. So if you have any questions like pertaining to the 3 things I posted, like the 3 main ideas from the Meno, or if you have any comments or critiques or something you disagree with, because there is a lot to disagree with here, put it in the chat. All right. No hiding. There's only 6 of you today, right? So you can't just expect to sit back and expect people like Enza to do all the heavy lifting, okay? You watched all the videos but did not get to finish the reading. That's fine. Now, Sarah, you know the true terror of coming into a humanities class without having done the reading. Especially a small one. I'll tell you what, my freshman year of college, I took a German literature course on the history of the novella. And there was only 4 of us. The class was so small, our professor invited another professor from Providence College, right, to sit in our class and like take the class with us. Yeah, dude, it took me, I'm rereading it, right? I'm rereading the Meno, and it took me like 25 minutes to read it, right? So the time estimates are only good for the videos I found for this course in particular. Anyway, let me get back to this story, right? Because that class was so nerve-wracking because, I mean, all of us spoke German, but it wasn't like our first language, right? So we had enough difficulty and trouble, like participating and like trying to speak intelligently about the books that we were reading or the novellas that we were reading. And that's hard enough as it is. But, you know, some weeks you're just really busy and you can't really do the reading. And I had a couple of those classes, and it sucks because those were 90-minute classes twice a week. And I distinctly remember the days where I didn't do the reading. It was just like a day of hide and seek. I was just trying with like all my heart to avoid eye contact with Professor Knisha. And I was so terrified. And I don't want you to feel that ever, you know, sir. So, but thanks for being honest about not reading. It's great. I appreciate the honesty. Yona asks, when Socrates talks about recollection from where? I know he talks about reincarnation, so is it from previous lifetimes? Enza asks, if Socrates believes that learning is recollection, then is he a teacher or does he just remind people of what they already know? Is that teaching? Lars. So he makes a distinction between virtue as in ability to explain and knowledge acquisition as simply memorization. No, that is not what he's doing, Lars. Let's go back. Let's start from the beginning, right? So like virtue. So when I first read the Meno, right, I remember distinctly thinking about like this definition of virtue. I thought about virtue as like the way we think about it today, right? Like innate, like good qualities that we strive for, and good. And like to define good in itself is very difficult, right? That's what ethics is all about. It's like the pursuit of a working definition of like what good is. And when I first read this, I remember kind of linguistically breaking down like what we mean when we say good. So when I say, oh, this is a good watch, or this is a good computer, what do I mean by that, right? In that way, we always talk about good as like a placeholder for just it works well, or it does what it's supposed to do, right? And I kind of took, on a really basic level, I attempted to define virtue and good as that, right? So I want to define a good person as someone who does like what people are supposed to do. And I labeled virtue as things people are supposed to do, right? So, but in a way that becomes a little circular, right? Because if I'm saying that people, you define how good they are just based on like if they do what they're supposed to do, and if I define that by like what's virtuous, then I'm just basically saying I'm defining virtue by saying like stuff that makes people good, and that doesn't really get us anywhere, right? And I think, but whatever virtue, whatever definition of virtue that you end up with, like today, it's pretty different than like the Greek concept of virtue, right? Which is like to maximize one's potential in the context of greatness, right? If you want to be personally great, like a great person. But even after learning the difference and the nuances between like our definition or idea of what virtue is and the Greek word arete and the whole pathos and ethos around that, I found that it didn't change my reading of the Meno at all, right? Or readings about virtue. Like everything they're saying about like this Greek concept of arete or virtue can be applied to like our contemporary vision of virtue, right? So I think while it's important to note the historical context of like what they meant by virtue or what we translate as virtue, that it adds historical context, but it doesn't really change anything in the grand scheme of things, right? And now we can go to probably one of the most famous dialogues in Western history, right? Plato reconstructing an old Socratic lesson about there being knowledge acquisition is the same as recollecting past knowledge, right? And Socrates uses this argument repeatedly throughout his life, and most famously in the Apology, when he states that he has never taught anybody, right? He goes as far as to say there's no such thing as teaching, because in this way he defines teaching as giving someone knowledge, right? But he says there's no way for me to give you knowledge that you do not have, because everyone already has knowledge of what they are capable of learning, right? And he goes as far as to say learning is the same as recollection. And through this incredibly well put together dialogue with the slave boy, right, and the Socratic lesson about finding square roots, he illustrates this to a profound degree, I think, right? Because nowhere in this dialogue is he telling the boy anything. He's not telling the boy, you are wrong, right? He merely points him out to counterexamples through which the boy realizes that he is wrong. And then the boy himself attempts to correct his mistakes, right? And in the end, it is the boy who realizes, oh, the length of a diagonal of an equilateral, the length of a diagonal of a 45, 45, 90 right triangle, right, is the square root of the double of the side length, right? It's 2 root 2, right? I mean, it's s root 2, right? Like the boy ends up discovering that on his own, right? Well, not on his own, but he thinks of it as an original thought. While he was prodded and guided by Socrates, it is he that comes up with it in his brain, right? Socrates never told him explicitly, like the formula for the diagonal, right? But the questioning does come from someone who knows, right? Yeah. So what inherently are you trying to disagree with here, Lars? Like, so what's the claim you're trying to make? Thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask a question so I can eat. And I'll answer Yona's question here first, and then we can move on to Enza and Lars's. Yes, Socrates makes a very bold ontological claim about souls, in that he posits that we are reincarnations of past lives, and throughout all these past lives, we have acquired knowledge. So in your current life, all you're doing is just recollecting the knowledge that you had before. This argument has so many holes in it, right? Because if you take into account that the universe had to start somewhere and it's not infinite, then you have to talk about your first incarnation. That first person must have learned something, must have been taught, and must not have been recollecting, because at that point his mind or soul was a tabula rasa, right? It was a blank slate. There his argument falls apart. However, one note, so Yona, that's where, his argument is not very sound, all right? But what has stood the test of time, right? And what is still being examined today is the theory of knowledge as something innate. This debate rears itself in math when many of your math teachers may ask, is math created or discovered? Right? Is it there to find? Right? Do we have it in ourselves? Right? Which to me opens the door for a lot of different. For me personally, this kind of to me personally, sorry, I've said that twice. Helps formulate a theory of intelligence or academic intelligence. Theories of intellect for me, right? For me, theory of intellect is not really related to IQ. It's not related to knowledge. It's not like street smart versus book smart. Okay, when I try to look at intelligence a little objectively, I branch it out into two different arenas. One is how quickly you can learn and how quickly you pick up on things, right? I think that's a pretty objective measure of like just how much you can learn. Like the more the quacker, right? I meant to say fast and quick, so I got quack. Like the faster you pick up on things, the more time you have to be able to devote yourself to the subject and get deeper and deeper, right? If you grasp the fundamentals quickly, then you can grasp more advanced things, and right. And if we all have limited lifespans and limited time, right, the amount of knowledge you accrue over your life is heavily dependent on how quickly you can learn, right? It itself can be a virtue. Who knows, right? And my second theory of intelligence deals with Socrates, is based off Socrates' theory of knowledge as innate, something that you're born with that you must rediscover. And to that extent, I would say different people have different capabilities of different upper limits of what they can learn, right? So, for instance, what's a great example here? I humbly believe, right, that there are certain things in music, especially atonal music and jazz, in like contemporary jazz that I myself am not capable of learning, right? Certain connections, I would say, between harmonic progressions that make sense to a lot of people that do not make sense to me, right? I believe that, you know, the modern contemporary way of saying that would just be like, I'm incapable of learning that and I'm aware of my limitations, right? The Socratic way of looking at it is saying like, that knowledge is not there. Like I didn't learn it in my past life, and I am incapable of learning it because I cannot recollect it. Right. So that in itself is a different kind of model, like based on like. I hope you get what I'm saying. Anyways, not that theories of intelligence are even that useful anyway, because, well, what do you do? What do you do with the knowledge that you have that, oh, X person is this smart and Y person is this smart? Like you don't really do anything, right? It's like pretty useless. Cool. So questioning can bring new information to discovery, like it can guide someone to any discovery. So that was a really long sidetrack. I asked Lars specifically, what point are you trying to make when he says, but questioning from someone who knows. Questioning can bring new information to the discovery. Like it can guide someone to any discovery so easily. Where I was prodded by my mentor to create a hypothesis which I could have never made on my own without his stream of questions. You don't know that for certain, Lars, right? I mean, there's a very good chance that you would have never made that connection or never realized what you ended up realizing through that program without the prodding of your mentor. But at the end of the day, he was only asking questions. And you are the one forming these ideas. Who are you to say that your mind was incapable of making those ideas when they made those ideas? Exactly. The questions merely help. To which I posit this question. I'm thinking about making a discussion prompt. I am moving towards easier discussion prompts. I've heard you guys loud and clear. And by loud and clear, I mean I hear the silence. All right. So I'll make simpler prompts. Here's one of the prompts. There is a great moment in the dialogue where he asks, what is the side length that gives a square an area of 8? And he says, well, it's 4, right? Because if 2 gave 4, then 4 must give 8, right? Area doubles, side doubles, is the slave's reasoning. And then Socrates says, well, he shows him no. A side length of 4 gives 16. To which the boy then says, all right, it has to be, and here's the moment, right? It has to be greater than 2, but less than 4. Let me try 3. To which Socrates draws a square of side length 3 and asks the boy to count the area, right? It's like, what is the area? Even though Socrates is asking questions, even though he's questioning, is not what he is doing equivalent to simply saying no. 3 gives 9. That's my question. Right? is positing this series of questions for this student, right, or this slave boy, right, this Greek slave. And he draws, when the boy guesses 3, he shows him a picture of a square of side length 3, right? But is not what he's doing the same as just telling him? 3 doesn't work because that gives 9. Because his line of questioning is essentially guiding the student to that conclusion anyway, right? So what's the difference? So, right, the real question behind this question, right, is what's the difference between telling a student a fact and then letting them come up with the idea on their own? Like, what is the difference there? Because is what he is doing not equivalent? See, that's the question, Sarah. I believe the boy would have the capability of recognizing his own mistake if he were properly trained, right? Like, for instance, like, if your math teacher always ingrained in you, always to double check your answer, then of course the boy would have eventually found out his answer was wrong, right? Because the boy would be like, okay, well, I'm guessing 3, let me check, right? Socrates is essentially checking for him, right? Plato, Socrates. I think it's weird to say that prodding with questions means that those learning always have the potential to form a question because Socrates has the knowledge to ask certain questions to make progress. He would not, because he would have no reason to. Whoa, Lars, that's a strong claim. I would push back and say everybody, every human being has an obligation to question themselves. It is the basis of critical thought. That's why we check our answers and stuff, right? Well, I want everyone to keep thinking about this. Enzo, are you still there? Yona, are you still there? I am going to email my AP class. Lars, I take that as a personal attack. I'm going to email my AP class saying that our little stream, our AP stream will be delayed by like 30 minutes. We're going to start at 10:30. I just got emailed in because it's 10 o'clock now. I don't want them to be confused. Wait, Mr. Soul, where are you? Calm down. Okay, it's going to email them. Okay. Yona, question. What does it mean for knowledge to be innate within oneself? That you have it. You literally have it, and you just have to remember. Whoa, Yona. That is a very spicy question. But that's not what Socrates is saying. That's not even close to what he's asking. Sure, Lars, the boy was a slave, right? But we're trying to extrapolate like Plato's lessons and the lessons of Plato's Socrates. To wait. Plato's Socrates, right? We're trying to extrapolate it to use in everyday lives, right? To 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 extract lessons from which like we can live our lives, right? And I think it's very fair to say that we should be questioning most things, right? Anyways, Dahlia, I know that was kind of a joke, but Yona, to answer your question, Ernest, I mean, sure, right? There seems to be a lot of scientific evidence that links um, genetic influence to like measured IQ as flawed of a metric that is to measure intelligence. Um, but we have no idea which set of genes there is that do influence these. Go as far as to say that there are probably many, and the actual interaction between these many different gene groups are like unknown, and it is beyond the height of folly to even begin to suggest a certain race uh, has these genes in more abundance, right? That's where we will kind of draw the line, right? We can agree that maybe these genes exist, but to even begin to postulate that they are more prevalent in a certain ethnic group or race is just scientifically unsound, right? Not that I don't think that's what you're trying to say anyway, right? Um, Yona is just trying to get into maybe a more contemporary interpretation of what Socrates was saying by innate knowledge. Um, Sarah asks, "Wait, yes, Dahlia, that's what Socrates. That's what Plato Socrates says. And we know, like most most of us would be inclined to say no, right? um, like yes, theories of innate knowledge can be true, but I think you'd be very forgiven in the wider academic community for rejecting Socrates' specific model of innate knowledge, which is carried out through reincarnation um, and multiple iterations of the self throughout time. Okay. So Sarah says, wait, I'm confused. So does he mean that we all have knowledge we could ever need already within us? He goes as far as to say this, Sarah. And what I'm about to say isn't necessarily equivalent to what you said, but it's very close. Everything you have learned, everything you will learn, you've already known. Like you never had the lack of knowledge. Like it was always there. You just had to discover it or rediscover it, as he would say. Enza says, oh yeah, Yona, exactly, right? So I'm glad I correctly interpreted your question. Okay. Below Yona, Enza, maybe not all of it, but everything we knew in past lifetimes, which ties into what Dahlia just said at the very bottom. Yes. Although we know, I mean, I'm not gonna like impart my own biases onto you, but I'm inclined to believe that that is not true, and that I personally did not live a past life, right? I would want to focus on what I can empirically prove, right? And there's no way to prove that I was reincarnated. Well, there is, kind of. Hmm. that is his theory, right? And you have to know, in contemporary circles, this is not a widely accepted claim, right? But what is still hotly debated and like talked about is theories of innate knowledge. Yes, Dahlia, there are experiments you can do. Like if I write down something like hyper specific, right, that only I know, like a poem, like a really long poem. I never share it, right? I lock it up in a vault. And then like 200 years later, someone writes the exact same poem, right? And you open up my vault and you compare the two. I feel like that's pretty strong evidence to say like this dude was a reincarnation of me, and that right, like beyond the realm of any doubt. Because let's say that my poem was like 50 pages, right? It was like an epic poem, and this dude like wrote it verbatim, blah blah blah, and there was no way for him to have like had access to my original work. Sure, I would say he's a reincarnation. That's enough to me. That's enough for me to prove that a reincarnation exists. It may not be for other people though, right? So that's why I said kind of possible to prove. Diman, that's why I said it's like a 50-page poem. Like the odds of it being a coincidence that it is exactly the same, word for word, punctuation for punctuation, spacing for spacing, indentation for indentation, is basically zero. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, Dimon. I mean, it's basic. It's like one over. It's over a trillion, right? And I'm not saying it's one over a trillion. It's one over a number that's larger than a trillion, right? It's like just beyond comprehension, like how improbable that is. Thank you, Enza. Right, Dimon, you're trolling. -1. Okay, we didn't even get to the last idea, which I want to do before we end. Oh, but you didn't even answer my prompt. Do you guys think that's a healthy prompt to answer? Right? Is that something you'd be willing to answer in written form? What's the difference between simply telling someone they're wrong and guiding them through a line of questioning, right, as Socrates does? Or what's the difference between telling someone like directly, like knowledge that you know, versus like letting them figure it out? All right, cool. Thanks. Typo. Okay. +1 for Sarah. Thank you. Where are Itamar and Ayanava? -1 for both. Guys, if you see Itamar, tell him I miss him. If you see Ayanava, tell him I miss him too. Ayanav always needs rest. He's like a bear. He's always hibernating. And I respect that, because I like my sleep. Let's get to the second point. I mean, the third point, right? Which I think is really cool. Knowledge versus true belief. This is so spicy and helps form the basis of what most contemporary philosophers today, like how we still, no, how they, I'm not counting myself within that group, how they define knowledge even to this day, right? Um, shh. It's how we. Did you do the reading, Dimon? Whoa, whoa, Lars, where'd you get that? Huh? There seems to be a little bit of confusion about knowledge versus true belief. Here, let me lay out the distinction. Okay. I can believe that let me put it this way. I can believe that the sun sets every day and it rises every day and it sets every day because some mythical deity holds the sun off a fishing rod and just moves it across the sky every day. Right? By all accounts, like what I'm saying is true, right? And that, and based on like what we can observe, right? Because what I'm saying is the belief. The belief is that the sun rises and sets every day, right? And my justification obviously is wrong. My reasoning is wrong, but the belief inherently is merely about the sun, right? So I am correct. Knowledge about what the sun does would be to say the sun rises and sets because the earth rotates on its own axis. Like today, philosophers like to define knowledge as true, justified belief. Like you can't be right just by coincidence. It's not enough to be correct. Knowledge only counts as knowledge if the true belief is justified. So in this sense, like a contemporary astronomer, we would say, it has knowledge about the solar cycle, right? The astronomer has knowledge of that because the astronomer can correctly predict that every day the sun will rise and set, And this astronomer has a justification or a reasoning behind it, right? An argument behind why this is true, right? Because the Earth rotates. Whereas someone in ancient times, we would argue, did not have knowledge about why the sun rose and set every day. We would merely say they had a true belief, a belief that happened to be true, right? Knowledge, essentially, according to Socrates and according to most classical epistemologians, is having a why or explanation behind a true belief. And that's why we say TGB, TJB, right? This is a very popular acronym to describe how we define knowledge: true, justified belief. Does anyone have a question about this? Am I being unclear? I wish I picked a better analogy than the sun, like looking back. Like true belief would be like, hey, if I plant, if I have a seed and I put it in the ground and I water it, it's gonna sprout. That's just true belief and opinion, right? Knowledge would be about why, knowing why the seed sprouts, right? No, true belief is true opinion. Belief is opinion, right? They're the same thing. It's like being right factually. Exactly. You need to be logically supported, right? Basically, if you say, let's say for another instance, like a politician proposes a budget, a tax break, right? And he says, this politician says, oh, this tax break, if I do this tax break, if I give everyone a tax break, unemployment will fall. And he does it, and like the tax break is implemented and the employment rate begins to fall. Does he have knowledge of our economic system? Does he have knowledge of the intricacies, like of how taxes like affect unemployment rate and like how like the supply chain and everything like that is? No, of course they don't, right? It just happened to coincidentally be true, right? Exactly. If you simply just memorize the formula and like do that, you do not have real knowledge, right? I would argue from a philosophical point of view, you don't have knowledge. Okay. Um, in the Meno, Socrates Plato paints like a really nice counter argument to that, where he paints Meno as presenting this argument to Socrates, saying, "Hey, I don't think, Socrates, I don't think there's a difference between true opinion and knowledge, because if you're going to talk about knowledge as an instrument for good, right? A guide that has a true belief and advises people based on that true belief will have the exact same results as a second guide who has not like knowledge over why this belief is true, right? Or why the claim is true. And they will be able to help their clientele exactly the same way, right? Because they're both right. Well, okay, they both predict the same thing, right? To which he asks Socrates, like, well, so what is the advantage of knowledge over true belief? And if you have done the reading, you would have seen that Socrates responds thusly. He he makes some flippant, like errant comment about like works of art in this Greek city, and how if you don't keep an eye on them, people will always steal them, so you have to lock them down, right? And he makes a comparison between like these works of like these statues and um, beliefs and knowledge. And he's saying beliefs do not have a tether. Because you have no reasoning or no logic to ground them in, you're just as susceptible to lose them or change your mind because they just happen to be true. And it's simply an opinion that can waver. Whereas knowledge is justified. And because you have that justification to fall back on, you will never lose it. Which is why true opinion is so dangerous, because while it's true in the meantime, and while you use it, it may be indifferentiable to knowledge. You're at risk of losing this true belief because it's simply an opinion and you don't have reasoning to fall back on it. So you can lose it at any time, right? That's where Socrates makes a distinction. That's where Plato Socrates makes a distinction between knowledge and opinion, and true opinion. Isn't that cool? Like he gives like a very measured and reasoned response to like why you should justify things. And why you should always strive to explain the why. It's so you can hold on to your true things that are true. And so you can hold on to knowledge. I think that's like the greatest thing. He then finally goes on to, what do they talk about? Then like, so, but then they talk about like how all knowledge must be taught. And for something to be taught, there needs to be a teacher, and that there are no teachers of virtue because they can't identify a single person who teaches virtue correctly. Neither a sophist or a father is capable. So because knowledge is then not virtuous, it cannot be taught. It can only come from divine inspiration from the gods. Right? Now, this isn't necessarily what Socrates himself believed. You should know this. Because in other works, he arrives at the opposite conclusion, that virtue is indeed knowledge and that it can be taught. Like, this is simply a dialogue, like a fictional dialogue between Socrates and Meno that Plato has constructed. Okay? It's not like a definitive resource that we have on which we can base an opinion of like what Socrates actually thought. Okay. Dahlia asks, at what point should you continue to justify something though? Ah, so your justification needs to be true as well, right? That's the thing. And if the Dahlia, what you have run into is a theory that I know an Australian philosopher is has published a lot on, like in the 90s and stuff. I forget the name, but they're basically trying to debunk TJB, right? Where they give an example of someone who believes something and who has a justification, but the justification itself is wrong. Where that still counts as knowledge and stuff. It's pretty cool. Who is meek and pure? I want to organize a lot of the things that are being said. Okay, so first of all, there's belief. Like anyone can have the belief, as meek and pure said. But meek and pure, kind of whoever you are, skipped a step. Then there's true belief, beliefs that you hold that happen to be true. Okay. For example, I said, without even looking at the weather forecast, I'm just saying, hey, it's going to rain tomorrow. And if it rains tomorrow, I had a true belief, right? Did I have knowledge of whether or not it was going to rain tomorrow? No, because that belief had no justification. That true belief had no justification, right? And then you have true justified belief. And the fourth level would just be to examine whether the justification is valid and sound, right? Again, you are failing to identify yourself. If you don't tell me who you are, I'm just gonna remove you. Meek and pure. All right. I like to know who I'm talking to and who my students are talking to. You're also a troll. So annoying. Okay, so moving on. Um, it's 10:30. I gotta move on to my other class. Um, look for the prompts, okay? And I'll post them today. And we'll have a meeting Friday at, let's say, 10 o'clock. Right? So you guys get an extra 30 minutes of sleep. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm just going through the rest of the chat. see if there are any unanswered questions. All right. So your assignment for the rest of the week is just to finish the rest of the videos. Sarah's already done that. Awesome. And to answer the prompts I will post later today. Okay. Cool. Thank you so much, guys. I've missed this. I'm glad we're doing this again. And yeah, have a nice day. You too, Dahlia. All right. I hope I'll see you later for the Regent stream. Okay. Bye.